Hey, welcome to Lawsplaining the Interwebs. I'm your host, Nick Rekieta. I'm a lawyer in central Minnesota, and tonight we have a little bit of a different episode. I apologize for the dramatic drop in energy from that intro to what we have tonight. But the intro is the intro, but the mood of the show is different. And there's a reason for that. But if you're not familiar, what I typically do is I go through a lawsuit or a legal issue or some opinion of a judge, and we go through line by line. And I explain kind of what's going on. I try and translate the legalese into words that real humans use, and explain what the arguments might be and what the existing case law says or what the statutes might say. But tonight I've got a little bit of a different story. Tonight we're going to be talking about the shooting down in Florida. And I did a different style of video on this a couple days back. But we have new information since then about the shooter himself being reported to the FBI. And what that means, and is the FBI responsible? Have they failed in their duties? And I think that's clear, right? No one thinks the FBI didn't fail. I shouldn't say no one. Someone out there, probably the FBI, thinks that they didn't fail, but they failed. They failed. Their job is some levels enforcement, and we have come to expect our law enforcement organizations to protect us. So tonight we're going to be discussing why the FBI will say that it didn't fail, and why our reliance on law enforcement organizations, no matter the quality of the people who may or may not be involved in those law enforcement organizations, why our reliance on them is ill-founded, and why our own Supreme Court says that they have no duty to protect us. So for tonight, it is a special episode. It will be a little more somber than usual, a little less jovial, and I am going to have a small glass of bourbon because a story like this needs a little bourbon. So if you will buckle up with me, we can get this show on the road. So as we have found out, this shooter who took the lives of 17 students, shattered the lives of countless other people, both related to the students who were other students in attendance, all of their families, the community, the nation. The same thing that happens in the wake of every mass homicide. Lives are put asunder. And so that has occurred, but we found out that this person, the shooter, had been reported to several different people, local police, to the school, ultimately to the FBI, with what appears to be, and certainly in hindsight is, a credible accusation that he had intentions on targeting a school for violence. We now know that, of course, is true because he did it. There's no way, being deferential just for a moment, there's no way that law enforcement would possibly know whether that tip was credible without investigating it. So why didn't they investigate it? That's a complicated story that involves a lot of issues about just how many tips these law enforcement agencies get. But we have decided as a society over the past 2.5 centuries that we need these law enforcement agencies, and their job is to protect us, anytime one of these atrocities occurs, we have a bunch of people talking about how, for example, and I'm not going to get deep into this argument, but the argument is that the individual people, we need to restrict gun ownership, largely restrict gun ownership, restrict the types of guns that people are able to buy, restrict all of that. And the idea, when people raise the counter argument of, well, what about my self-defense rights? What about my ability to protect myself from criminals? The response is, many times we have law enforcement for that. Call the police. We have people who are supposed to be helping us. So we as a society have given up part of our rights. We have given up when our country was founded, every able-bodied man between the ages of 15 and 45 was expected to own a gun, and in many states required to do so, as they were part of the militia. But we have compartmentalized that militia duty. We have compartmentalized law enforcement. We've created these large multi-billion-dollar organizations that are supposed to take care of these things so that we don't have to get a posse together when justice needs to be served. And that's ultimately probably a good thing. But what happens when they fail? And what happens when they fail on the same thing over and over and over? The justification for their involvement in at least these things starts to look a little thin. Where does this all come from? Where does the idea come from that we should be protected and served? Or more importantly, where does the legal justification come from that we don't deserve protection and service from law enforcement? That we do not have a legal right to those things? Where does that come from? It comes from a lot of places. But most importantly to this case is a case called Castle Rock v. Gonzales. Gonzales v. Castle Rock? Let's see. Castle Rock v. Gonzales. It's a Colorado case. And it's an awful story. And I'm going to tell you that story because it's in the lawsuit. I'm going to read this from the sterilized words of Justice Scalia. The actual story, of course, is much worse because it's not in a court document. This is a clinical retelling of the relevant facts. So we won't try and dive into the grisly details. We don't need that. That's shock. And this story doesn't need shock value. The shocking thing is the events, of course, and then the ruling of the court. So I'm not going to read through the entire lawsuit. That's 20 pages. It would take a long time, and this video isn't supposed to be that long. I'm going to start right when the relevant facts started. Let me set up the background. There's a mother and a father. They have 3 daughters, ages 10, 9, and 7. And the mother is the primary care provider and has the main custody of the children. The father was awarded custody, partial custody, visitation rights, basically. He was allowed to take the daughters on alternate weekends for 2 weeks during the summertime, and upon reasonable notice for a midweek dinner arranged by the parties. That was the agreement that they had. All other times, the father was restricted from seeing the daughters because of his history of abuse. They actually had a restraining order, a protective order against him. So this man was deemed to be a danger to the children and to the mother by the state He had been ruled so outside of specifically planned times. He was not allowed contact with them unless the mom consented. That's how all these things kind of go. But he was not allowed time with them. And so that's the background that we have. We have a restraining order that the mom got against the dad because he was determined to be a danger due to his past activity. And that restraining order specifically stated that he was not allowed to have contact with the girls outside of his specified time, and that if he had made any contact with them, it would be criminal, it would be illegal, and that the police shall take every measure necessary to arrest him. They shall. That's commanding language in the legal world. Command means do it, or shall means do it. So that's the background that we have. So here we go. According to the complaint, at or about 5 or 5:30 p.m. on Tuesday, June 22nd, 1999, respondent, that's Gonzales. Gonzales' husband took the 3 daughters while they were playing outside the family home. No advance arrangements had been made for him to see the daughters that evening. When Gonzales noticed the children were missing, she suspected her husband had taken them. At about 7:30 p.m., she called the Castle Rock Police Department, which dispatched 2 officers. The complaint continues, quote, when the officers arrived, Gonzales showed them a copy of the temporary restraining order and requested that it be enforced and the 3 children be returned to her immediately. The officers stated there was nothing they could do about the temporary restraining order and suggested that Gonzales call the police department again if the 3 children did not return home by 10 o'clock p.m. At approximately 8:30 p.m., Gonzales talked to her husband on his cellular telephone. He told her he had the 3 children at an amusement park in Denver. She called the police again and asked them to have someone check for her husband or his vehicle at the amusement park and put out an all-points bulletin for her husband, but the officer with whom she spoke, quote, refused to do so, again telling her to, quote, wait until 10 p.m. and see if her husband returns the girls. At approximately 10:10 p.m., respondent called the police and said her children were still missing, but she was now told to wait until midnight. She called at midnight and told the dispatcher her children were still missing. She went to her husband's apartment and, finding nobody there, called the police at 12:10 a.m. She was told to wait for an officer to arrive. When none came, she went to the police station at 12:50 a.m. and submitted an incident report. The officer who took the report, quote, made no reasonable effort to enforce the temporary restraining order or locate the 3 children. Instead, he went to dinner. At approximately 3:20 a.m., Gonzales' husband arrived at the police station and opened fire with a semi-automatic handgun he had purchased earlier that evening. Police shot back, killing him. Inside the cab of his pickup truck, they found the bodies of all 3 daughters, whom he had already murdered. Gonzales had a restraining order. She had an order from the court to enforce justice upon this person, to stop him, to restrain him from having contact, from taking, from harming the children, or from her. None of those things were done, despite her actually providing information on at least alleged whereabouts. We'll never know if he was actually at that amusement park. He may have been. He may have had the girls there. We'll never know because the police didn't go. This is the problem. What happens when you put your trust in the government to protect you the way it's supposed to protect you, and it doesn't do it? What do you do? In this case, you sue. You sue the government. You tell them that they violated your rights, and the case bounced around the lower courts, got appealed up all the way to the Supreme Court, And the Supreme Court looked at this, and they only found one tiny possible argument, despite the inherent wrongness of going through the judicial process to get a restraining order. Going through that process to get the restraining order, and then having the law enforcement officers blatantly disregard its command that they shall do something. They shall go arrest him. They shall make an effort. They shall do whatever is in their power to do. Despite that, they did nothing, telling her to wait, not investigating when she gave them a potential location, not even following up with her when they said to remain at the place she was, because they were sending out an officer, and they never sent one. And then ultimately, finding three dead children as a result. The court only found one argument possible, and that's under the Fifth Amendment, something called the substantive due process clause. That basically, the theory is that the temporary restraining order granted to Gonzales for her protection, the theory is that would give her a property interest in the enforcement of the restraining order. And it's a weird way we look at things, but it's kind of a holdover from how our legal system of rights developed in England. Is through property. The enforcement came through property. So now we're saying that this piece of paper issued to Gonzales gave her a property right in that protection from the government, and that the substantive due process clause would require that property right to be enforced. If that property right was not enforced, then the person who had the right would be given some sort of compensation because the right wasn't honored. And the court disposes of that through this. They lead off with a different case. It's called Deschaney versus Winnebago County Department of Social Services. And this case has a similar story attached to it. Local child protection officials failed to protect a young boy from beatings by his father that left him severely brain damaged. And in that case, the Supreme Court ruled that the so-called substantive component of the due process clause does not, quote, require the state to protect life, liberty, and property of its citizens against invasion by private actors. The entire purpose of government, of our government, is to protect those three most sacred values: life, liberty, and property. Property being the original wording of Pursuit of Happiness. But not wanting to confound the idea of the pursuit of happiness with slavery, the ownership of property, they changed it to the pursuit of happiness. They didn't want that associated with slavery. So, but what does government exist for other than to ensure the protection of life, liberty, and property to the extent that it's able? That's the whole purpose. Of course, we have the government enforce our property rights. Many people, I think incorrectly, but many people would argue that without a government, there could be no property rights at all, that in an anarchist system, property rights can't exist. Again, I don't buy into that, but that's the working theory. That lays out the importance of the state's role in protecting that property. The state enforces property interests all of the time. Whenever you buy something at a store, you're buying the right to a specific understanding of an item. And if the item doesn't perform the way it's supposed to, you have a property interest in either getting your money back or in the right, or in the correct performing product. And you're able to go to the government and demand that they enforce that property right. If someone tries to kill you, or in fact, if someone does kill you or a loved one, you go to the government and you ask them to intervene. You say that this death was wrongful, and you're entitled to some sort of compensation due to the varying losses that you would endure from having a loved one perish. The government exists solely, when you boil it all down, to ensure the life, liberty, and property of its citizens to the maximum extent that it is able. And they create institutions like law enforcement agencies and tell us that their job is to protect our life, our liberty, and our property. But when they don't do it, their justification is that was never their job in the first place, and no one could expect them to do that, and holding them to that duty is unreasonable. That's where this comes from. Frankly, I think it's sickening that we would put our trust in these institutions, and when they fail us, they give us a sorry, not sorry. We really deeply regret the fact that your life is now shattered. The fact that 17 lives are now injured. We really deeply regret it. We know you've given us all of the power. You've given us the power to monitor your communications. You've given us the power to restrict your ability to speak, to restrict your ability to travel, to restrict your ability to protect yourself in many instances. You've given that duty to us, but when the time comes for it, they're not accountable. At least they claim they're not accountable. That they didn't have a job to do, that they failed. They had a job that they do, that they weren't able to do ideally in this situation. That's how they get out of this. That's how they get out of it every time. Every time there's a failure of our law enforcement system to protect us from the things that we're supposed to be protected from, every time it's, well, that's not our role here. I mentioned this in the other video briefly, and I'm going to mention it again because I think it's important. I don't, but collectively as a society, we send our children to these schools. These schools absolutely should have a duty to ensure the safety of the children. They tell us you don't voluntarily send your children to school. Not sending your children to school or otherwise providing proper education within whatever definition your state uses is often a crime, at least until the children are a certain age. They demand that we send them to their institutions, and then their institutions consistently fail to protect the children from dangers. And there's always some weird excuse for it. But the ultimate excuse that they have, the ultimate underlying theme is it's not our responsibility to keep your children alive. That's the underlying theme. When whatever your position on the school shooting problem, we'll say, there are things that they can do to mitigate the potential loss. There are things that private organizations do to mitigate these types of things. There are disaster plans. There are various risk mitigation methods. They, some companies hire armed guards. People have talked about putting armed guards in schools. I don't know if that's the right answer. People have talked about how cheap it would be in the scheme of things to put bulletproof glass on the windows of schools, or to provide bulletproof backpacks, or there are lots of different ways in which our schools can protect our children. And it always comes down to some weird cost analysis, as if building $60 million high schools wasn't a thing that we do regularly. As if hiring some security guards would be a gross imposition on the absolutely absurdly inflated cost of public schooling. The per student price on any of these things is pennies, in all honesty, in comparison to the other stuff which we already dump in, which does not keep children safe for the 8 to 10 hours that they are in the care of the government. And that's a real question. The government's first commission is to protect the life, liberty, and property of its citizenry. That's the first commission. Education would actually be secondary, or even more likely tertiary. But we put the idea of educating children in specific ways or specific ideologies above their basic safety. And that's a weird thing to me. That's a very strange thing to me. Well, anyway, I think I've said my piece on this. Just know that the FBI, no matter how much they give very carefully worded and expertly delivered apologies that do nothing to help the families and say nothing about what types of reforms they will be making to ensure that the next time that they get a credible tip about a person who's likely to shoot up a school, that they actually follow up on it. They'll talk in vague terms that they're going to improve things, although they'll never tell you how. The next time they say it, know that their ultimate posture, and this is what the posture is. When I say it's the ultimate posture, it's because this is the posture that the government takes every time someone tries to hold it to account for failing to protect life, liberty, or property when it's their duty to do so. Every time they say, actually, that's not our responsibility. But what do they tell you every time they pass legislation? Why did they pass the healthcare legislation? To protect the lives of its citizens, right? And make sure health insurance, everybody has health insurance. That's their goal. Their goal is to protect your life. Why does the FDA exist? To protect us from all of the dangerous foods and drugs that we may be consuming. They're there to protect your life. Why do the courts exist? To protect our property. To make sure that when someone steals something or treats you unfairly in business, that you have somewhere to go. But when a law enforcement agency that's designed to prevent this sort of atrocity fails to prevent this sort of atrocity, even though they had credible, actionable information, and they don't do it, what's the first thing they say? It's not our role. We regret this. We regret this tragedy, as if it was something that couldn't be possibly have been stopped. Anyway, sorry to be a little more somber tonight, but I think decorum dictates a little more serious attitude towards this subject. But I really appreciate you watching. You can find all of my social contact information down in the description. And I hope this video is educational. I hope you know why the police, the FBI, any federal law enforcement or any state or local law enforcement will claim that they don't have a duty to protect you. That's because the Supreme Court decided they didn't have a duty to protect you. And the opinion was written by Scalia. So before you think it was Breyer or someone like that who made this horrific ruling, it's a guy who many people would consider that he would take the opposite approach. But yeah, he's right there. That's him. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you have a good night. Peace.